and to the film festival. And Jody and Wesley, when Jody, Wesley, and Karen McGrath and I from the Miller Center sat down in the spring to think about how to continue our partnership together on showing films about presidents, we all stumbled on this movie, which had just been, or is just about to be released on HBO, and is a double perfect movie for the Miller Center. It both is something that we contributed to in a direct way, and after the film, you'll get to see a conversation with Guian McKee from our Presidential Recordings Program, which is busy at work transcribing the secret Oval Office recordings of the Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon administrations. And this film is based in part on those recordings and those transcriptions. So we have a terrific opportunity to have one of our lead scholars, a professor in our program who leads this transcription effort on the Johnson tapes, and a Pulitzer Prize winning playwright and screenwriter who worked with those materials to produce first the play and then this movie. It's really quite extraordinary coming together of various things. It's also a perfect film in a second way. Not only is it based on our work, it corresponds exactly to a big project that we're doing at the center now, which looks back across presidential first years. We know and study the presidency, not just the presidents from Kennedy forward, including in our oral history program, but a range of American presidents. And presidential first years are really significant moments, not just in the presidency, but in the country's life. Lyndon Johnson himself coined the phrase. He said, you get 1 year before Congress stops thinking about you and starts thinking about their own re-election. And you have to seize that first year and try to accomplish great things. So we're going to show you a short movie of our own on this, and then we'll show you the film, and then afterwards, please stick around for the conversation between Guian and Robert Schenkkan. Thank you all for coming. For staying and for watching that terrific film. And I want to bring to the stage Guian McKee and Robert Schenkkan, the screenwriter and the Pulitzer Prize and Tony Award-winning playwright. So please, why don't you go on up on stage and I'll do a quick introduction. As I mentioned before the film, Guian is in our Presidential Recordings Program, which has been transcribing the secret Oval Office recordings. There were 4,000 hours of recordings in the Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon administrations. It's incredibly painstaking work to transcribe them authoritatively, because you have to figure out who is in the room, connect the voices to the names, and then get all the words right. And when you're discussing complex matters like the Civil Rights Act passage or the war in Vietnam, doing all of that right is incredibly time-consuming and detail-oriented, and Guian and his colleagues in presidential recording do it very well. Robert Schenkkan is a Pulitzer Prize and Tony Award-winning playwright and was a screenwriter. He won his Pulitzer for the Kentucky Cycle and won a Tony for All the Way on Broadway. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Guian.
Thank you, Bill. Please welcome me today in joining the writer of what I think is possibly the best film depiction of an American president that certainly I've ever seen. And as a scholar of the presidency, I think I've seen most of them. So please join me in welcoming Robert Schenkkan. Robert, as Phil mentioned, we do a lot of work on the White House recordings at the Miller Center. One of the things I love about All the Way is how effectively you captured the way Lyndon Johnson used the telephone as a political tool, the way he would use it as a way to intimidate, to gain information, to advance his agenda, and frankly, what was happening among his enemies as well. We talked about this a few days ago, and I think the way we're going to begin today is with a short excerpt from another White House recording from the period just after what we see in the film. This is January 1965, immediately before the inauguration of Lyndon Johnson to full term as president, and he's talking to one Gerald Ford, representative from Michigan, who had just unseated the minority leader of the House Republicans to become the new minority leader, launching his own career, which will, of course, a decade later, take him to the Oval Office. So if we could run that quick clip, about a minute, of Johnson talking to Gerald Ford just before the inauguration, and talking about how they're going to attempt to work together.
We don't want to make an issue of it. I don't want to start off fighting with you because I'm not running for re-election. I'm just trying to make a good president. And I want you to help me, and I told you that, and I talked to you about the Warren Commission. But that's all I'd like. I'd hope we could have the relationship that I had with Eisenhower, that you could support me when you thought it was right, and would, and be proud of it. And I think it'll get you more Republican seats than anything else if you show that you're not picayunish and not fighting. But anyway, that's a matter for y'all to determine any way you want to. I want you to know as much as the President knows, and I want you to have that assurance and that confidence, and I want you to have that participation, because when I get run out of Vietnam, or when I get in a war with China, or if I got another stalemate for a year, they're going to be Republican boys shot just like Democrats, and they don't know the difference. They're all patriots, and so I want everybody's decision can get it. And I'm perfectly willing and anxious to admit, just like I know you would be if you wound up here in the morning, by faith like I did, to know that I don't know all the answers.
Should be an unremarkable conversation, but I think
So we don't want to make an issue.
2 days before the 2016 election, it's all too remarkable. But what I wanted to ask Robert about is the way an artist, a writer, uses historical evidence. How it's different from the way a historian like me would do it, how it might be the same. And to lead into the larger question of how you use those secret recordings in writing the script for All the Way.
Well, I think I do a fair amount of this, fact-based or historically based work on stage, television, and film, and I'm always very careful in public to emphasize that I'm not a historian, and I'm not a documentarian. I write fiction. And that means that I will take the historical event and historical people, and I will play with chronology, I will omit things, I will put people in rooms together they maybe didn't share at the same time, I'll have them say things they didn't say, I'll write dialogue. But the one thing I don't do, my rule, my golden rule, is that I can never have one of these individuals who's based on a historical personage say or do something that I think is antithetical to who they really were. And that to me is the bottom line. But even if I really wanted to be, absolutely 100% accurate, you can't. I have, as an artist, I have at most 2 hours to tell my story. 2 hours to tell the story of 1964. Well, you can't possibly do that. You're going to have to leave out a lot. And the minute you start leaving out things, you are changing the narrative. So I'm very, very conscious about that, and I'm always try to make it clear when I talk to people about the difference between what I do and what a historian does, and as a consequence, you have to evaluate us and the success or failure of what we do differently. There are a different set of rules in operation. I do think that taking a story from the past, particularly a political story, that there are real advantages to that, because sometimes you can get at a contemporary issue, sometimes a very hotly contested contemporary issue, by looking at it through the lens of a past event more clearly than you can if you attack it head on, because people are just too partisan, too fraught to be able to hear it. But if you place it in the past, somehow lets people's guards down. I think this is one of the great advantages of historically based work. So to the question of the use of audio tape here, I did listen to a fair amount. Again, not all of it. It's, what did you say, 5,000 hours or something? I mean, I'd still be listening to it if I started. I will tell you a funny story about these recordings, if I may. When Johnson left the White House, he had a favorite desk. It was the desk he used as a vice president. He decided that he was just going to take it back to the ranch with him. Well, it happened to be Richard Nixon's favorite desk, too. And when he got into the White House, he was very upset. Where's my desk? Well, it's down at the White House. It's down at the Johnson Ranch. So President Nixon called President Johnson, "I want my desk back." So Johnson said, "Okay, sure, of course," and sent it up there. But the story goes that Johnson confided to Nixon that he, Johnson, had taped his phone calls in the office, and that now that he was writing his autobiography that Doris Kearns Goodwin was helping him with, he found these tapes invaluable, and he would really recommend to President Nixon that he tape his calls too. So, the revenge of Johnson. I did, actually there are two, at least two moments in here where I really, abstract dialogue. I'll just use one of them. That's there's a phone call between then FBI Director Hoover and LBJ. This is after the sex scandal of Walter. And in the middle of this phone call, they're talking about how they're going to manage this and what the problems are. And Johnson is not very happy about this, as you can imagine. And then suddenly he switches and he asks, he says to Hoover, he says, how do you know when somebody's that way? And there on the tape is J. Edgar Hoover schooling LBJ in how to spot a homosexual. It's just, I heard that and my jaw hit the floor. I thought, that's got to be in there somewhere. That's just too delicious.
Another one, I don't know if it was conscious enough, the conversation with Senator Dirksen about how do you want history to remember you. It's, I recall from the...
when you're trying to find a character's tone and vocabulary and idioms and rhythm and vocal mannerisms, to have this resource available is really extraordinary. Now, the danger is, and particularly the danger is for the actors, and I warned all the actors, both on stage and in the film, not to go down the rabbit hole of being too slavish in terms of imitating the actual speaking voice. As you heard, Johnson is sort of measured, it kind of goes on a long way. And if Bryan Cranston had spoken like that, the movie you just saw would have lasted 3.5 hours instead of 2. So, you have to take a liberty to keep things entertaining. So it's useful to me, I think particularly. It's potentially useful to an actor, but there's a danger there if they get too caught up in mimicking. I always said, look, we're not trying to. You're doing my version of Hubert Humphrey. You're doing my version of Everett Dirksen. We're not a docudrama here.
The thing I wanted to discuss with you, and partly goes to those questions of length and where your limits are. What were the challenges in taking all the way from the stage to the screen?
Well, I really saw it more as an opportunity. Quite frankly, I was, for one, it gives me a much bigger audience to share this story with, but it also allows me to do things that I couldn't possibly do on stage. What was important to me, and I said this right up front with Steven Spielberg and Bryan and then later at HBO, is that we were not just going to shoot the play. I had no interest in that. I wanted this to be a complete cinematic reimagining of this story. And everybody was on board with that, and that's exactly what we did. So I'll give you 2 examples of changes I made that you saw today that were different in the play. There's a scene towards the beginning of the movie after LBJ has given his speech to Congress in which he says, civil rights, we're going to pass that bill. And it's a scene that didn't appear in the play at all. Night, Oval Office, the door opens, LBJ walks into the room. Now he's been in that room hundreds of times, both as Senate Majority Leader and then as Vice President. This is the first time he enters the room as the President. And it's still full of Jack Kennedy's memorabilia. So the weight of the dead President is very, very clear, painfully clear. It's almost an entirely silent scene. It's all played on Bryan's face. When you have an actor as nuanced as Bryan Cranston, you want to give him all the face time you can. And you can just see him in this moment as the weight of the office, as the crown descends on his head, and you can feel what that means to him. And then Lady Bird comes in and they have this lovely little moment between the two of them. You could do that on stage, but it would not have anywhere near the impact that it would on film, because you get so close into Bryan, and you could take that kind of moment. Then here's the aqua car scene, which is so delicious, isn't it? I mean, when I read, I forget which book I was reading, I read so many books, that Johnson had an aqua car on the ranch, and that he liked to take guests, unsuspecting guests, on tours, and that he would pretend to lose control of the car and drive it into the lake, and he just thought this was hilarious. I read that and I thought, oh my God, that's got to be in the movie. Well, again, there's no way you could do that on stage effectively. It just wouldn't be the same. So I took an existing scene, which was set originally in the Oval Office, and it's a scene in which LBJ muscles Hubert Humphrey. He gives him the full Texas twist treatment to bring him around to support the bill and to be, even without voting rights, and to be the leader on the bill, and put it in the car. Now I had to cut the scene mercilessly. It's probably a third of what it is on stage, and I had to cut this fantastic dirty joke that LBJ tells on stage, but it wouldn't last in the car. The car is the joke, and so there's an instance in which I took a scene, trimmed it staggeringly, and placed it in a completely different context. But the context it just does so much. It's funny, it's surprising, it's completely LBJ, and it works. You know, you can see it as yet another device, like LBJ always did, to put the opponent at a physical disadvantage so that you could muscle them.
Speaking to the trick with the floating car, I believe he was especially fond of doing that with members of the press, as I understand. I wanted to turn to some of the relevance of the film in this period for where we are today. Members of the audience saw a short clip about a project the Miller Center is doing right now on the first year of the presidency through history and looking ahead. If you were to speak to the winner of Tuesday's election, what would you hope that they might draw from the film, or Lyndon Johnson's first year more generally, about the way he handled the political process, the people around him, the nature of what politics is or should be?
Wow. It's changed a lot since 1964, and not all in good ways. I would emphasize what Johnson emphasized and what was such a huge part of his success, which is politics is always personal. And it's about the relationships. It's about making relationships, trying to find ways in which you can find common ground. That was at a time when, of course, compromise was not a dirty word. In fact, it was how you did business. Nobody thought twice about it. It was at a time when crossing the aisle was not seen as an act of political betrayal, but what your job was. So the situation has changed a lot. But that would be my recommendation, is that somehow the rhetoric, this awful rhetoric, will continue, but in the behind closed doors where the deals get made and progress hopefully gets made, people have got to talk to each other, and that's all about relationships. You can't start off demonizing the other. You've got to know who they are. You've got to know what they need and what they want, what their constituents need and what they want, and try to approach political problems from a pragmatic, personal point of view, rather than an ideological point of view.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to Lyndon Johnson as a subject for a play first, and then of course for a film, and even what your personal experience of Johnson might have been?
I grew up in Austin, Texas. My dad moved us there from North Carolina when I was 3. He was a pioneer in public television and radio, and he'd been hired by the University of Texas to set up the first public television and radio station in the Southwest. And his first job was to go to then Senator Johnson and get his permission to do that, because it would have been a direct competitor with Johnson's own media empire, or should I say Lady Bird's media empire, because of course it was all in her name. And I'm pleased to say that he did give his permission, and of course as president he would go on to sign into law the bill that created the Corporation for Public Broadcasting that creates what we now know today as public television and public radio in this country. So in my family growing up, LBJ was a good guy. He was one of the good guys. And there is a story about an invitation to visit the ranch, and our car getting stuck in the mud, and LBJ, Senator Johnson, driving out in his Jeep and helping to push our car back onto the road. I don't know, it sounds a little apocryphal to me. I was very young at the time, I don't remember it, so I asked my older brother, Pete, who actually graduated from University of Virginia here, as did my father, whether he remembered meeting LBJ. And he said, oh yeah. I said, well, what was he like? He said, you know, it's funny, I don't really remember him. What I remember is how incredibly respectful our father became around this strange man, which is maybe in its own way a more telling anecdote. But that election, 64, that's the first one I remember. I wore my all the way button, I had stickers on my books, I volunteered with my mom on Congress Avenue at the LBJ headquarters, and I got to stay up late and watch the returns. And then a year and a half later, troop levels in Vietnam had ratcheted up from 25 to 175,000 troops, and my oldest brother was nearing draft age, and I had a very different feeling about LBJ. 10 years later, I'm a young adult with a family, trying to make a living as an artist in this country and becoming aware of social programs that are actually very helpful to me in my circumstance, that were all the product of the Great Society. And so then I have yet another feeling about LBJ. And now, after having spent, the better part of 8 or 9 years reading, thinking, writing a play and a film about him, I have a very complicated relationship with President Johnson.
So yeah, spending that much time on it, we'll do that. I think I just feel that way. Listening to too many hours of his conversations. Watching the film again today, one of the things that struck me, and you just mentioned Lady Bird's role in the Johnson fortune, but Lady Bird's central role in his political career, and a depiction in the film today, how important that is. Can you talk a little bit about Lady Bird and how you approached her character?
Yeah, I mean, one of the frustrations and challenges of telling a story like this is that there were not a lot of significant women leaders, women in power. And I'm very, very happy to have brought back Fannie Lou Hamer at least a little bit into public consciousness. By and large, power by women was wielded in the way in which you saw Lady Bird wield it, as an advisor, as a helpmate. And she was enormously influential. Johnson had a lot of rough edges and was famously emotional, as you saw. I mean, really, that's not an exaggeration. He literally went to his bed and refused to leave and said he was going to quit the presidency. And she's the one who said, "Come on, Jack, buckle up. Let's go." He was routinely, flagrantly unfaithful to her. He could be very cruel in public. And yet there's no question that he adored her and that he desperately needed her, and he would have been lost without her. I don't think he would have, there's no way he would have had the career he had without Lady Bird. Everybody liked Lady Bird. And so it's an interesting look at a time where the patriarchy is very, very rigid, and you see how inventive women have to be in order to exercise any kind of power within it.
On that theme, patriarchy and gender roles were a powerful element in the civil rights movement as well. How did you manage that in depicting civil rights leadership and then Fannie Lou Hamer's emergence at Atlantic City?
Well, the thing that I'm most interested in my version of Dr. King and all of these various leaders of the civil rights movement was something, an aspect of Dr. King that I honestly have not seen in popular culture, or not even that recognized him. And that was what an extraordinary politician he was. People talk about Dr. King either as the orator or the martyr, but he was an amazing politician. The fact that he could keep what we call the civil rights movement, we talk about that like it was a monolith, which is of course ridiculous. It was a collection of very different groups, each one run usually by one very charismatic, strong-willed individual. And each one of these people had their own ideas about what the goals should be and what the strategy should be and who should be in charge, usually them. And that Dr. King was able to keep all of these very, very different people moving in the same direction for as long as he did is a testament to his brilliance as a politician. And then, like all politicians, of course, Dr. King was faced with extremely painful compromises. Principles long held, promises made in public that he had to renege on, that he had to swallow in order to make the progress that was so desperately needed. And so the point here was to see these two leaders, Johnson and Dr. King, operating in parallel worlds, each one of them trying to wrangle a very, very contentious and challenging constituency that was often at odds with itself, and how they were still able to not only bring their people around, but to reach across and make progress. Because that's how progress gets made. That's how politics gets done in this country. And that kind of painful compromise and sacrifice. So it's very important to me to do that. Fannie Lou Hamer, really, and Fannie Lou Hamer and Lady Bird are in many ways kind of the conscience of this film. Fannie Lou was just this amazing individual, comes out of the Delta, very little education, you know, a sharecropper's wife, and she meets Bob Moses, another amazing, extraordinary individual, a true American hero, and gets caught up in the notion of voting rights and devotes the rest of her life to it and becomes, by sheer dint of moral force, a national leader. We were so fortunate at that time to have these Americans in our lives. It was really quite amazing.
I'd like to take any questions from the audience now. Anyone would like to ask anything of Mr. Schenkkan? Yes.
I was wondering, how did you get the FBI tapes are obviously, they're not public. How did you reconstruct those?
Are you talking about the sex tapes?
Well, yeah, those and there were suggestions that the FBI was taping any number of...
Oh, that's very widely established. No, there's no issue. There's no issue over that. Well, some of those tapes, like the sex tapes, for example, are under a federal seal, and they can't be opened for another 25 years. I don't think they should ever be opened, but that was the decision the federal courts made. The suicide letter that accompanied the tape that Hoover sent. A copy of that exists, that was found just recently. It had been discussed and known, but somebody actually found a copy of it a couple of years ago. So, particularly loathsome document. Your tax dollars at work.
Yes.
Yes, Robert, I know that you have background in acting from our days at the University of Texas, and I recognize that as you were speaking, much of the conversation about the actors and their characterization was really very directorial. How much connection do you have with the director, with the company as you're creating the casting, and obviously input during the process of filming, and the correct person or the face and how that works together with Robert McNamara looked exactly like Robert McNamara, or at least every other actor I've ever seen play McNamara.
Yeah.
So it was very interesting in watching that.
Yeah, well, a screenwriter in Hollywood, you don't have a lot of power, typically. And the reason you don't, this is important, playwrights retain the copyright on their work, which means that as a playwright, you cannot change a word of my material without my permission. Screenwriters gave up the copyright in the 1930s. It was part of the price they paid for forming a union. And the unfortunate and rather devastating consequence of that is that my work as a screenwriter, the producer, the director can do whatever he wants with it. They can completely rewrite it. I have no say in the matter. So in most situations, what I have is a moral suasion. I try to make the best possible case for why something should stay the way it is, because it actually sets up X, Y, Z, and if you change this, it's going to have these consequences. Or, I think this will actually give you more of what you want. Let's talk about what your problem is, and let's see if I can solve your problem in a different way. In this instance, all the way, I was an executive producer, as was Steven Spielberg and Bryan Cranston. So I had as much power as a producer as you could possibly have, and I was the sole screenwriter. So in this instance, unlike anything else, any other project I've just done, and I have a movie that just opened this weekend, just opened Friday, called Hacksaw Ridge. In this instance, I was extremely involved. So I wrote the script. I was present for all the casting. I did location scouts. I met with designers. I was there for every rehearsal, and I was on the set for the entirety of the shooting. And then I responded to each edited version of the screen. So I was very involved. Does that mean that I got my way all the time? No, I didn't. You win some, you lose some. And that's okay, because sometimes I'm wrong. It's shocking. It happens, but it does. And my feeling has always been that this is an intensely collaborative art form. My feeling is I just want it to be good. I want it to be great. So from my standpoint, the best idea in the room wins. It doesn't have to be mine. I'll take credit for it later, but the best idea in the room wins. So in this instance, I couldn't have been more involved unless I was actually directing it myself. And Jay Roach is a terrific director and a wonderfully collaborative individual. He really, he wanted me on the set. He wanted to know what I thought of each setup and of each take. And, it was the best possible kind of experience I could have had.
Thank you.
Yes, this will be our last question.
It seemed to me that Lady Bird was much more prominent in the film than in the play. Am I right, or did I just see a bad actress in the play?
You didn't see a bad actress. You saw a great actress in the film.
No, I mean in the play.
Yeah.
No, I'm saying you saw a great actress in the film, and you saw a good actress on stage. Melissa Leo was phenomenal, but to very specific, yes, you're right. You're actually right. I did expand her role in the film. It was one of the, when I said earlier that I was excited about doing a film adaptation because I could do some things I hadn't done on stage. Well, one of those was to bring Lady Bird even more forward. So I actually wrote new scenes for her. Not all of them wound up in the final version. Alas, we shot all of them, but not all of them wound up. But I wrote new scenes, I wrote additional material, I expanded it. And the Johnson family, I have to say, was very public in their enthusiasm for this version of Lady Bird and for Melissa Leo. They're very, very protective of Lady Bird, and I get that. I totally understand that. So yes, that was my intention, you're quite right.
Well, just one last question I wanted to ask you. After all the years I've spent listening to Lyndon Johnson and studying his presidency, his essence to me, his core, is that young teacher in the Rio Grande Valley. Curious what your sense of who he really was is, if you agree with that or if you find a different essence to it.
Well, I think Johnson did not have a single core. He had a multiplex core. I think, you know, in the question that comes up for a lot of people, did Lyndon Johnson really care about civil rights, or was it just politics? And my answer is he absolutely did care about civil rights. He did. He meant it. And for me, the proof of that is a speech he gave in 1963 at Gettysburg. He was vice president, miserable because he had no power as vice president. And the Kennedy administration let him off the chain long enough to go to Gettysburg and give a speech on the anniversary, you know, so just get out of here, go. So he goes out there and he gives this humdinger of a speech in which he says, you know, the men who died here, we haven't finished the job. We failed. We've failed. Their sacrifice we've not honored because we keep telling African Americans to wait. Time's not right. Just not now. Soon. He says, it's too late for that. It has to be now. And the press just flipped out. They were like, whoa. And the Kennedy administration was really uncomfortable, and they yanked that chain back and put it back in the White House. But that was a speech he didn't have to give. I think it came out of his heart. And so there is a part of Johnson who, that idealistic school teacher, believing that kids are important, that education is important, that integration is important, and that government exists to make people's lives better. Yes, that's absolutely at the core of Johnson. But also was this terrible paranoia, this impossible black hole of lovelessness that could not be filled in any possible way, vindictiveness. I mean, he's such a complicated guy, such a complicated.
Please join me in thanking Robert Schenkkan for being here.